Hi, everyone. I'm Nadya Okamoto. I'm 21 years old and a rising junior at Harvard College, and I believe that it is a fundamental human right to be able to discover and reach your full potential regardless of a natural need. And what could be more natural than menstruation? I'm Nadia, and I'm here to talk about periods. And I know that periods aren't the most common thing to be passionate / pretty obsessed with for me. So I thought I'd share a little bit of a story of why I'm so passionate about periods. So my passion for periods comes from a really personal place. When I was 16 years old, my family experienced living without a home of our own. And during this time, I talked to homeless women who were in much worse living situations than I was in. And through asking them the question what they found most challenging about their living situation, I discovered this unaddressed natural need of menstrual hygiene. I collected this accidental anthology of their stories of using toilet paper, socks, brown paper grocery bags, cardboard to take care of their periods. The moments that stuck with me were when they would show me how they would pull off a piece of cardboard of what they were sitting on, take off the edges, rub the middle in between their hands, and use that as a menstrual pad. And hearing these stories catalyzed this sort of possibly unhealthy obsession with period poverty for me. And I started Googling just wanting to know more about period poverty. And through that, I decided that I needed to do something about period poverty every time I collected a new fact about the magnitude of this issue. The big turning point for me that pushed me to finally take action was when I learned about the tampon tax and the fact that in 2014, 40 states in the US had a sales tax on period products, considering them luxury items. Meanwhile, products like Rogaine and Viagra are considered essential goods. Right? So for me, at the age of 16 years old, I decided that I needed to do something because America thought that old man hair growth and erections were considered more of a necessity than over half of our population feeling clean, confident, capable, ready to discover and reach their full potential. So I started this organization called Period, the Menstrual Movement, which is now the largest youth-run NGO in women's health in the world. We fight period poverty and period stigma through service, education, and policy. So we're distributing period products all around the world. We're trying to change the way people think, talk, and learn about periods. And we're now fighting for menstrual equity through policy from the local to the federal level. So in the last 4 years, we've addressed over 510,000 periods through product distribution, and we now have almost 400 registered campus chapters at universities and high schools around the US and abroad. So when I started this organization, it was really just me and a best friend wanting to take action about periods. And when we started, my co-founder, Vince, who you saw in the last picture, at 16 years old as a male non-menstruator, he didn't even know what menstruation was. But fast forward 4 years, we've built this sort of what we call the menstrual movement. And this past year, I just published my first book called Period Power, a manifesto for the menstrual movement, out of this idea that we're no longer just students organizing on weekends for fun, but we're this movement that's fighting for social and systemic change. So what is the menstrual movement? I define the menstrual movement as the fight for equitable access to menstrual hygiene and eliminating the period stigma. But when I think about what the goal of all of this is, the end goal is not menstrual hygiene at all. It's not just about talking about periods, and I'm not going to be satisfied if we just end period poverty. But the end goal is really gender equality and equity. And I want to take a note here that throughout the rest of my speech, you'll hear me use the term menstruators, because when I think about gender equality, it's not just following this gender binary, but it's also acknowledging that, one, not all women menstruate, but not all menstruators are women too, right? But we must be inclusive of the experience of transgender men and people who are non-binary, but assigned female at birth might still experience menstruation. And when we think about gender equality and why periods become such a big priority issue, is we need to be thinking about fighting gender equality in a really intersectional way. So the reason I think that the menstrual movement is inherent to our fight to fighting for gender equality is because when we look at how the UN, the World Health Organization, talk about what makes up gender equality, the factors really fall into these three buckets of healthcare, mobility, and by that I mean education and economic mobility, and governance. And I'm kind of going to walk you through how periods factor into all of these. So when we look at healthcare and equal opportunity and equal gender equality in healthcare kind of falls into these two buckets of fighting period stigma, but also research as well. Throughout history, emotions and pain experienced by menstruators has been discounted, dismissed, or minimized by doctors. And I think one of the great examples of this is endometriosis. So endometriosis is a condition that 10% of women in America have, but the majority of them don't know that they have it because it's really hard to diagnose. And a lot of the times when menstruators go to a doctor or a medical professional and they talk about endometriosis and they talk about excruciating period pain, it's discounted or dismissed as cramps, right? Same thing with conditions that might screw around with hormones or things like that. And so for us, what we're trying to do is fight for this idea that we need to be taking gender-specific conditions and their symptoms very seriously, but also be pushing forward solutions. Because for a thing like endometriosis that affects so many people in America, there's still no cure for it, and there are limited options for treatment. And this brings me to my next point of some of the importance of fighting for gender-specific conditions and solutions to them is getting more women in the medical field. It wasn't until 1993 that women were even included in clinical trials by the NIH. Until 1993, women were treated and thought of as just smaller men. My second point is around equal opportunity and access to education and economic mobility. Periods are the #1 reason why girls miss school in developing countries. And because a girl's first period often signifies this cultural moment when she can suddenly become a wife and a mother, a girl's first period is often the time that marks when a girl drops out of school, gets married early, or undergoes female genital mutilation or social isolation. And things like child marriage, the magnitude of that issue is still very prevalent. Still today, 15 million underage girls are married each year. To put that into context, that's about 37,000 girls every day. And one of the strongest strategies to pushing and delaying child marriage is by keeping girls in school. And how can we do that? Is by, if we eliminate the period stigma, and we could continue fighting for this idea that when a girl, even when she's menstruating, can still go to school and still participate equally amongst male peers, that's one of the solutions that we can do we can keep fighting for to keep them in school. In the US, 1 in 4 women in the last year struggled to afford period products due to a lack of income. And 1 in 5 girls miss school due to their period. There's been research that shows that period-related pain in the United States is a leading cause of absenteeism for girls in the US. And so one of the things that we're trying to do within this movement is fight for the idea that period products should be treated as a necessity. In St. Louis alone, there's a recent study that came out that said 46% of women had to choose between a meal and period products in the last 6 months. And that statistic alone shows that we have so much more work to do, both in terms of fighting the systemic barriers as well. In the US, food stamps and financial assistance programs like that don't acknowledge period products as a necessity either. So one of the things we're trying to do is fighting for period products to be accessible in all restrooms, whether they be in public schools, in shelters, in prisons. There's been a great resurgence of period product innovation, which is extremely important to fighting period poverty because it provides this reusable solution. So you see period underwear, menstrual cups, cloth pads come around, and that reusable solution offers this idea that someone doesn't have to be spending $10 a month on getting period products anymore. But what I want to talk about on this one specifically is that period product innovation is still very much needed in terms of our international aid work, right? Because there currently doesn't exist a product that addresses period poverty for people in rural communities in developing countries. Because when there's no constant access to clean water, but there's also no waste management system, you suddenly can't be distributing disposable or reusable products. So a lot of the work that we're trying to do to fight education and economic mobility internationally also comes with figuring out what products we're sending out and where we're sending them out, and how we can be approaching this in a sustainable way. Lastly, governance. And this is my favorite one to talk about. And I'm going to talk about governance and sort of equal representation in this, both in government and in industries. So my first statement is that periods can still be powerful. For far too long, even though people have been menstruating since the beginning of humankind, and over half of the global population menstruates on an average of 40 years of their life for a monthly basis, periods are still a reason for why women and girls all around the world are hindered from reaching higher decision-making positions. emotions. And a lot of this is from the belief that when someone is menstruating, they're less capable or less likely to be able to fulfill the responsibilities in the same way. There's this thing called menstrual leave that's practiced in a lot of Asian countries and enforced as a way for women and menstruators to take sick days 25% of the month. And it's sort of a double-edged sword because on one hand, it's being more understanding of the symptoms and how period pain can be a real hindrance for people, especially when they're trying to go about their days. But at the same time, period breaks and menstrual leave becomes a reason for why women and girls and menstruators aren't being promoted, because it's this excuse of 25% of the month they won't be able to fulfill their responsibilities. And so this is something we're trying to fight for and just trying to end this stigma and say menstruation is natural, it doesn't affect capabilities or ability to fulfill responsibilities, and periods can still be powerful. This leads me to my next point of periods can be presidential. In 2016, it was literally an insult thrown around regularly that Hillary Clinton could not be president because 25% of the time she'd be menstruating. Which is funny and goes to show the need for more education because Hillary Clinton was a decade too old or so to get her period. So a lot of what we're trying to do is just say, understand periods, but also know that periods shouldn't be a reason for why women can't be president or hold the front lines of combat. In the US, one of the more progressive countries in the world, less than 25% of our congressional seats are held by women. And if the remaining 75% of men are afraid to talk about periods and can't even say the word period or menstruation out loud, this need will continue to go unaddressed. In the US, still today, 34 states tax period products as luxury items. And in states like California, California makes around $20 to $28 million a year from taxing tampons alone. We need to elect representatives that either understand periods, understand period poverty, and are unafraid to talk about it. We can only achieve gender equality when we are represented equally. So this kind of brings me to going back to what I'm trying to show all of you today. When we think about how we're going to achieve gender equality and equity, which helps us achieve global development and ending the cycle of poverty globally, we need to be thinking about periods. Because when we look at how we achieve success in healthcare, mobility, governance, the menstrual movement and this fight for equitable access to menstrual hygiene should be a priority issue for us. So how do we do it? Right now, I think of the short-term solution as service, right? We're distributing hundreds of thousands of units of period products to people in need every month. But I think that the long-term goal is policy. It keeps me up at night realizing that if my organization disappeared, we've made no sustainable change beyond the policy we've put in place, right? We can only truly make long-term systemic change if we change the system itself. But as we've done that over the last few years, we keep coming across this barrier where legislators are afraid to talk about periods because they think it will lose them support from people who don't want to talk about periods. Or they think that what the legislation they're pushing forward will not pass because voters, constituents, or colleagues won't also agree with prioritizing addressing period poverty. So what we have to do, along with our fight to change period policy, is change culture, right? Get people to acknowledge menstrual hygiene as a right and not a privilege. So that comes with getting people to talk about periods and redefining how they talk about periods. So this is kind of what I've been focusing on over the last few months, is really getting into mainstream media. It wasn't until 1985 that the word period was ever said on television. And there are still radio interviews that I do today that are taken off air because menstruation is considered an inappropriate bodily fluid to talk about. So we're still doing this work just to try to get menstruation to be talked about in a normalized way in mass media, and we're going to continue to do that with a long-term goal of changing policies. So bringing back to what we can do today. What we can do today and starting right now and after this is turn to our neighbors, turn to our communities, and try to fight for the idea that menstrual hygiene is not a luxury and it is a right. It's easy to sit here today in Chicago amongst more progressive friends of ours and think duh, it's a right, not a luxury. But the reality is so many people, especially people in positions of power, don't agree with this statement. It was just 3 weeks ago now that a GOP representative in Maine stood up and said that free period products should not be free in prisons because prisons aren't meant to be country clubs. And that bill to provide free period products in state prisons was rejected in Maine. So that's just one of many examples of us just trying to fight for the idea that period products should be treated as a necessity. And why do we believe in that so strongly? Because every human deserves to feel confident, ready, and to discover and reach their full potential, regardless of a natural need like periods. So I hope you will join me today, and welcome to the menstrual movement. Thank you.